Sai Ram. In today's math session, you are going to perform a math lab activity. This is our fourth math lab activity in class 6. This activity is based on topic representation of decimals on grid paper, which we have learnt in chapter 8 decimals. Let us watch this video to understand this activity. In this math lab activity, we will see how to represent decimal numbers 0.25, 0.5 and 0.75 using 10 by 10 grid. To do this activity, we require some materials, and that are 3 10 by 10 grids, which is this I am showing you on the screen, and 3 markers of different colors for shading. Here, children, to get 10 by 10 grid, you can draw 10 rows and 10 columns on a plain paper of equal sizes, or you can use square notebook page like this, on which you will draw 10 by 10 grid. Here I have drawn 3 10 by 10 grid on a plain paper. If you will observe carefully these grids, you will observe that each grid contains 100 small squares. Now, to represent decimal number 0.25 on 10 by 10 grid, I will take first grid on which I need to represent the decimal number 0.25. Here 0.25, which is written as 25 hundredths or 25 upon 100. This means out of 100 squares, we need to shade 25 squares. Now we will shade 25 unit squares out of 100. Shade first 10 squares, then next 10 squares. This will make 20 squares. Children, instead of this marker, you can use crayon colors also. Now next we will shade 5 more squares. So this will make 25 unit square. Here I have shaded 25 unit squares out of 100. That makes 25 hundredths, and this represents decimal number 0.25. Now we will see how to represent the next decimal number 0.5. For this, I will take another 10 by 10 grid. 0.5 will be written as 0.50. Isn't it, children? This can be written as in the fraction form as 50 upon 100. This means here 50 hundredths, that is out of 100 50 squares. Here to represent 0.50, we need to shade 50 units squares out of 100 unit squares. Let us see how to shade 50 squares on 10 by 10 grid. To represent 50 on the number grid, I have taken yellow color marker and I am shading first 10 squares like this, then next 10 squares, that will make 20 squares. Then after 20 we will shade next 10 more squares, so this will make 30 squares. Then next 10, this will become 40 squares, and last we will shade 10 more squares, so this will make 50 squares out of 100. Isn't it? Here, children, this 50 squares out of 100 represent the decimal number 0.50 or 50 squares out of 100. So here I have shown you how to represent 0.5 or 0.50 on 10 by 10 grid. Now to represent our third number 0.75, we will take third 10 by 10 grid. Yes, children, and using this 10 by 10 grid, we will represent the decimal number 0.75. Children, 0.75 means 75 hundredths. That means 75 upon 100 in fractions, isn't it? Now, children, here to represent 0.75, we need to shade 75 unit squares out of 100 squares. Now let's begin with shading part. For this I have taken this marker, and now what we will do, we will shade how many squares? 75 squares. So let's begin with this. Like this, children, you are also going to shade the 75. This is first time I have shaded. Next, this represents 20 squares. Next, 30. Then here I have done 40, 50, then 60, then 70, then 5. 70 plus 5 means we will do this 5 very carefully, children. So here the shaded squares represent the decimal number 0.75. That means 75 out of 100. So children, here the figure A represents the decimal number 0.25. That means out of 100, 25 squares are colored or shaded. Then figure B represents the decimal number 0.050 or 0.5, which is equals to 50 upon 100. That means out of 100 square units, 50 are shaded. And figure C represents the decimal number 0.75. That means here out of 100 square units, 75 squares are shaded. Understood, children? So we finish this activity over here. Now let us see how to write the theory part of this activity. So first we will write aim, and that is to represent decimal numbers 0.25, 0.5 and 0.75 using 10 by 10 grids. Then you will write materials required. In that, first is 3 10 by 10 grid papers. Then second is some color pencils or crayons or markers. Then you will write prerequisite knowledge that we require to do this activity is knowledge of fraction and decimals. Then you will write procedure. In that, first step is take a 10 by 10 grid and shade 25 unit squares. The shaded portion represents 25 upon 100 or 0.25, which is shown in figure A. Then you will write second point to represent 0.5 means to represent 0.50. For this, take a 10 by 10 grid and shade 50 unit squares. The shaded portion represents 50 upon 100, that is 0.50 or 0.5, and it is shown in figure B. Then you will write third point to represent 0.75. Take a 10 by 10 grid and shade 75 unit squares. The shaded portion represents 75 upon 100 or 0.75, which is shown in figure C. Then you will write observations. In that first point, you will write the total number of unit squares on each 10 by 10 grid is 100. Here, if you will see, I have shown you the 10 by 10 grid, and if you will count the number of total squares on this 10 by 10 grid, you will see it is 100. Children, no need to draw this grid in the observation. Then you will write second point in the observation is the shaded portion in figure B represents the decimal 0.25 which is shown over here. Then you will write third point, the shaded portion in figure B represents the decimal number 0.50, and fourth point you will write the shaded portion in figure C represents the decimal number 0.75. Children, no need to draw this figure in your observation. Then after observation you will write conclusion. And what is conclusion? Conclusion is 25 parts in 100 equal parts represents decimal number 0.25. 50 parts in 100 equal parts represents the decimal number 0.50, and 75 parts in 100 equal parts represents decimal number 0.75. Then last you will write learning outcome. Students are able to understand decimals with the help of this activity. Children, here we have performed this activity number 4. Then write this activity in your Maths Lab notebook and stick the picture of 10 by 10 grid on which you have performed the activity. Thank you, students.